I want to talk about the two types of sleep apnea just as it relates, because for me, I've always been like thin, lean, fast metabolism. And one of the things that I've kind of dealt with when I went through all this stuff is, you know, in the past, like sleep apnea, OSA, has typically been like the 60-year-old on the couch with 50 pounds overweight and they're snoring logs. So with OSA, what tends to happen from a perspective of health is these people either start to have apneas or hypopneas, which means they either stop breathing completely or they have like a 30 to 50% decrease for more than 10 seconds as it relates to if you're to get tested. The third thing tends to be like desaturation. So the oxygen levels will drop more than 2 or 3%, which will basically kind of put the body in motion with some of the stuff we've talked about today. The other sleep apnea I want to talk about today is UARS. So this is something I learned a lot about because I had 2 at-home tests and then 1 in a lab. And I realized that most people don't understand UARS. So for all your young, leaner, thin, fit people, this tends to be the new modern day sleep apnea. The issue with testing for it is there's a lot of different basically theories as to what it is. And for many years, all they did was test for OSA. So when it comes to UARS, I ended up catching in a podcast with Dr. Stephen Park, doctor in New York, after I had been tested, used a CPAP, had no results. And then I ended up going and getting tested in this lab in New York City. And what I found was that, you know, there's only a few places I would say that are good at testing UARS, which means many people will get tested that have UARS, but they'll be compared to OSA standards. And most people with UARS don't stop breathing partially or fully for more than 10 seconds. And they don't desat when it comes to their oxygen. So these people tend to always show up as fine or mild sleep apnea. But the issue with UARS is these people tend to have high labored breathing all night long. And it's like that the whole night when you sleep. So you don't actually stop breathing, but your body works really hard. And then what ends up happening is there's signals in the brains that shift the brainwave activity if you have this type of apnea. And then what ends up happening is these people go from deep levels of sleep to basically lower levels of sleep. And that happens all night long. But when you talk about like skinny people that have bad insomnia, anxiety, depression, all these types of things, I have read probably 100 medical journal articles, but a lot of that ADHD, asthma, all these breathing issues, especially people that are pretty skinny or lean, that all comes back to this type of sleep apnea, which after I found the doctor in New York, I Googled the top 10 Yelp rated sleep docs in Arizona. And I had sent them my doctor's criteria for testing in a lab. And I couldn't find one person that tests like him in Arizona. And the reason I was reaching out is because I wanted to find doctors that I could send people to. So it was something where it was like, okay. So, you know, for those that basically deal with fatigue, sleepiness, yet they tend not to be overweight and they're pretty active, like this is a sleep apnea up until probably about 2 years ago I'd never even heard of. And this is where I've spent a ton of time researching because I think modern day, so many people have this chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, you know, all your Crohn's, IBS. You look at this body type and then the tens of symptoms that you tend to have with UARS, and it's crazy to see kind of what people have. So all right, guys, so the one video I want to show today is just kind of showing people what sleep apnea is, just so people kind of have an idea and kind of can go from there.
Obstructive sleep apnea occurs when the upper airways collapse, resulting in holding of the breath during sleep. After a period of time, the sleeper partially wakes up, gasping for air. This cycle of breath holding followed by gasping can occur many times an hour during sleep. In addressing obstructive sleep apnea, two factors need to be considered. The first is airway size, and the second is the amount of air that we habitually breathe. In relation to airway size, the narrower the upper airway, the greater the negative pressure as air is drawn into the lungs. Habitual mouth breathing during childhood can alter the shape of the face, resulting in small or receding jaws. This reduces airway size and increases the risk of lifelong sleep apnea. As we get older, loss of muscle tone in the upper airway also contributes to holding of the breath during sleep. To help open the upper airway, it is important not to sleep on the back and also to breathe through the nose. The second consideration in obstructive sleep apnea is the amount of air that we breathe. It is very common for people to habitually breathe too much air, as indicated by audible breathing often through the mouth. Heavy breathing during sleep increases negative pressure in the upper airways, causing collapse. Imagine inhaling a large volume of air through a collapsible paper straw. The heavier one breathes, the greater the likelihood of the walls of the straw collapsing inwards. On the other hand, breathing light through the straw causes less negative pressure, thereby reducing the risk of collapsing the walls. Breathing re-education to reset the breathing center in the brain to a lighter breathing volume significantly reduces the occurrence of obstructive sleep apnea. Combining this with myofunctional therapy to strengthen the upper airways enhances the benefits, resulting in a significant reduction in apneas and hypopneas.
So the two things I want to talk about here, one being, the size of the jaw and the airway really help kind of create a pump. So when the tongue rests on the roof of the mouth, we pressurize the cheeks, and it's like when my tongue pushes on the roof of my mouth and I go to push on the roof of my mouth, it creates this vacuum, really allows me to pull air in very efficiently with my nose. So part of the reason why that's so important is the size of your jaw is going to dictate how strong your pump is as far as your ability to pull air in. I think the second thing I've learned a lot about, there's a famous dentist in Australia, Dr. Stephen Lin, and what he talks about is just the nutrients in our food are not what they used to be. So if you think of like two straws, like back in the day, like our nutrients in our foods were a lot better. So the building materials for everything in our body were solid. So if you think of like a straw for like a Yeti cup and how solid that is, a lot of our basically airway in our tubes used to be made of solid material. And then you think of like where it said there, like a wet straw. So think of like a paper straw that gets a little bit wet. Modern day, like most of us are left with basically materials that built our body that are not what they once were. So as a result, we have to compensate because we can't move air due to the quality of our pipes, if that makes sense. And so all these are little things that are being taken, a little bit here, a little bit there, but it adds up and creates this perfect storm where a lot of people, once they get into their 30s or 40s, have issues with sleeping and breathing well, and it's scary for people because